Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is Charlie English, author of the CIA Book Club. Its subtitle tells why I found, and I think you will find, Charlie's latest to be so fascinating: the secret mission to win the Cold War with forbidden literature. From its headquarters in Manhattan, the CIA Book Club secretly sent millions of banned titles, pamphlets, and other reading material into the East. By the 1980s, illicit literature was so pervasive in Poland that the state censorship machine was rendered all but useless. Soon, the Iron Curtain fell. As Charlie confirms with his amazing tale, books really can set us free. Charlie is a former reporter and editor for The Guardian and a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. He's the author of 3 nonfiction books that demonstrate an open-minded curiosity. He'll be speaking with us from London. Charlie English, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you, Jim. It's nice to be here.
Charlie, when did you first hear of the CIA Book Club?
Well, I was reading an obituary of a British philosopher called Roger Scruton, who died a few years ago, and I read a kind of interesting fact in this obituary, which was that he had not only carried books into the Eastern Bloc himself, but it encouraged all his students to do it. And it seemed to me like there was a kind of organized operation behind this. And I thought that's really interesting. And I was kind of casting around for a kind of a new story to sink my teeth into. And I sort of stumbled across this idea that the CIA had actually been promoting sending books to the Eastern Bloc. And so I kind of, dug more and more into it and found there was a story that hadn't really been told properly inside there. I kind of started digging into it. There'd been some kind of academic coverage of some aspects of this story, and I began traveling to Poland and interviewing people there who had been involved in it in one way or another. And, gradually the whole watercolor painting, if you like, started to come together. I mean, it involved um, interviews in Poland, in France, in DC. I was trying to sort of pick up both ends of this story, which is still very largely classified. The CIA haven't
Ah,
released most of the documents that relate to it. Um, so yeah, I mean, it was a question of sort of pulling together from all different sources. I mean, one of the great things I found was a series of reports that the head of the program had left behind when he died. This was a guy called George Minden,
yeah.
and he had traveled to Europe twice a year to meet his contacts in this kind of CIA book smuggling operation. And then he'd written up his notes. And his wife, when he got back to New York, his wife was a New York Times journalist, but she typed up his notes. And when he died, these were given to the Hoover Institute archive at Stanford. So once I got hold of those, which had a load of names in that I could then follow up in Poland, then I was really on the right track, if you like.
Yeah. I first, I should say I'm an unabashed fan of this book. I think it satisfied me on so many levels. Um,
Thank you.
you are excellent with minutia. Um, I mean, what the paper was like, what was wrong with the mimeograph machine, and things of that nature, and what the smells were, and I mean, it's really fascinating how deep you drive us in there. And I have the impression that every time you opened a door, you found like 4 more doors.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I mean, it took me, the process for something like this is very long-winded. I mean, it took me a good 5 years, I think, from sort of concept to finished book. And there are a lot of blind alleys you go down, and then you talk to someone who knows someone else, and then you talk to that person, they know someone else. And so, yeah, in a way, it's doors opening. In a way, doors are also shutting because you need in a book like this to find a kind of a central narrative backbone, if you like, and you need that to be kind of character based. And so it took me quite a long time to find Miroslav Hoyetsky, who is the kind of hero of the book, if you like. And I sort of, I came to him early on, and then I thought, maybe not, and went away, and then I kept coming back, and I thought, actually, this is the guy that, needs to be central to this thing.
How
Um,
far, I'm sorry, Charlie, how far along were you when you finally realized how you wanted to tell the story?
uh, well, I was probably, I mean, I had an idea of, I wanted it to be a sort of dramatic, this genre we're in, which is narrative nonfiction, needs to be a dramatic telling of history. It's not just a kind of this is what happened
Right.
then. So I knew from the start that I needed that, but it's quite a long way from knowing that to finding the people and the operation, if you like, that actually will fulfill those criteria. So all the time as you're going through, you're trying to sort of tighten the narrative and um, make it. I mean, you're trying to kind of simplify, which is what is really a very large and complicated bit of history. So we're talking about the end of the Cold War. Initially when I looked at this story, this operation began in the 50s, right? So there is a kind of almost 4 decades of history there that includes most of the world and certainly Europe. And so it's a process of constantly kind of winnowing down to a core of something taught, narrative, character based that gets across this really quite complicated period of history. And I think, if it's a success, it's because that process has worked, and that you've come down to a handful of characters who between them can tell a lot of different aspects of this operation and how it worked and how successful it was.
Yeah. Could you tell us about Miroslav Hoyetsky?
Sure. So he's a kind of lifelong Polish dissident. So the book is set, as you know, largely in Poland during the Cold War or among the Polish expatriate community in Western Europe and in the States. Um, Chojecki is in Poland at the start of the story. He is the son of very heroic anti-Nazi resistance fighters who were both in the Warsaw Uprising, which was doomed to failure, but they they risked their lives and lost lots of friends fighting Hitler. So he had this kind of backstory of fighting for Polish freedom and independence. And in the late 70s, he became an underground printer. So in the late 70s, the Polish opposition gelled around this organization called KOR, Kor, and Chojecki became their printer or publisher, and he was publishing in the underground, so illegally. He was publishing books that were outlawed by the Polish censor, which was, the Poles had a very draconian system of censorship, as every country in the Eastern Bloc did, imposed by Moscow. So he was an underground publisher, was arrested continually. I think he was arrested something like 40 plus times. He was force-fed in jails. And then come December 1981, he is outside of the country. He's actually visiting Washington to try and find support for his underground printing operations. And at that moment, a Polish General Jaruzelski, declares martial law in Poland and basically locks the country down, arrests all the opposition activists, and Hoyetsky is caught outside the country, so he's forced into exile. And what he does at that point is he's very quickly actually introduced to the CIA in DC, and he moves to Paris and starts running he's basically his kind of unofficial or semi-official title is Minister of Smuggling for the Polish opposition. The Polish opposition at that time is basically this organization called Solidarity, and Chojecki operates as minister for smuggling, and his job is to get in literature, print supplies, all the stuff that you need to run a kind of underground resistance campaign within Poland, and he does that very successfully for the next well until 1989, so until the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Now, I recall reading Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago in the 70s, but I have to say it was a bit of a shock to be reminded just how brutal the SP and the Soviet system was when you write about Hoyetsky's time in prison. Um, how do you, as a writer, prepare to communicate such brutality? Do you have to steel yourself and try to become detached, or do you have to have a visceral reaction to that brutality?
Um, I wanted to really conjure the jeopardy, I guess, the risks that these people were taking, and it seemed to me that I couldn't do that without putting across the full horror of what he experienced in that jail. So I think, I guess, some people may find it disturbing. To be fair, having written about the kind of Nazi cultural policy in my previous book, I didn't feel this was too horrific. If you see what I mean. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
he's sort of. I mean, he's force fed, and it's deeply unpleasant. And he loses enormous amounts of weight and so on. But he's not. It's not a kind of death camp situation. So I suppose what I'm, and most of that actual that first chapter that you're talking about is based on an account that Hoyetsky wrote in the underground around about 1980. I think it came out in the summer of 1980 in an underground magazine. So, as long as he was happy for that to be told, and I was happy to tell it. I thought it was fairly a good way to set up the kind of risks and the jeopardy that these people were taking.
yeah. Earlier, you talked about the necessity of the element of drama in the narrative nonfiction form. And I think that there are sections of this book where the writing um, it goes beyond reportage, Charlie. I think um, it's it has the sort of um, emotional impact of fiction, which I always think requires that the writer experience what's being written at some level um, emotionally.
Hmm.
So the sort of point of my question is, I don't have the sense that you just dashed off that stuff. That you knew this was not the way people should live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're trying to place the reader in the situation, and that involves the writer placing themselves in the situation, and putting myself in that apartment that night when the secret police come round and the child is crying and you're being told to pack your toothbrush and you don't know where you're going. And yeah, I mean, I think it's actually very important that I feel a kind of visceral response to this, and that I can express that on the page,
Yes.
because that's the only way the reader is going to be able to get the same emotion out of the story. And I think if you don't engage emotionally, it's well, it's not meaningless, but it's a much weaker account. And I think it's even the people who were involved in it. I mean, I've obviously people who've I've interviewed have read the book subsequent to publication and told me they were sort of brought back to those days. I mean, we're talking about what 45 years ago now, and they're in their 70s or older, and I think it's a nice I see it as a kind of tribute to the book that people feel it took them back to that moment, when they felt
Yes,
these things.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you tell us about the CIA's Free Europe Committee that, among other activities, dropped 260,000 copies of Orwell's Animal Farm into Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. Would you mind just telling us how they did it?
Yeah, so the book program began really out of the balloon operations that the Free Europe Committee were running in the early 50s. The Free Europe Committee was a sort of propaganda, psychological warfare arm of the CIA at that point. It used East European emigres largely to do its work. A lot of emigres had washed up in the West after the Second World War because they were fleeing Stalin and communism, and which had been imposed on their country. So they were very motivated to liberate their own countries, but they didn't have any kind of resources really. So the US government, through the Free Europe Committee, gave them these resources and sort of, I guess, steered them to an extent. And so the early operations were basically bombarding Eastern Europe with propaganda leaflets, and these would be attached in payloads of vast quantities of leaflets to these balloons, which were filled with helium, and the Free Europe Committee employees who were, they had a big branch in Munich, and they would drive out to the German countryside, just to the west of the Iron Curtain, and on a day that the prevailing winds were all blowing in the right direction. And then they would attach these big payloads of leaflets to these balloons and then send them up in the air, and thousands of balloons would go up, and they were designed in a way that they would reach a certain altitude and then burst. Or another type of balloon was slightly permeable and it would gradually lose its gas as it flew, so it would sink to Earth. But the net effect was that these leaflets rained down on Eastern Europe, for year after year. I mean, I think hundreds of millions of leaflets were dropped, and it was kind of ineffective because nobody. I mean, the leaflets had no value. They said things like, the winds of freedom are blowing. People on the other side have not forgotten you. That kind of message, which didn't really help anybody. And but when they started sending books, and you referenced this drop of Animal Farm, which I think was the first book that was carried on balloon in a special kind of lightweight aerial edition. And later they started sending these books through the post because the postal censors were not that effective. They weren't 100% effective, so the books got through. And what they realized in the Free Europe Committee and in the nascent books program was that people liked books and they wanted to keep the books. And they would often, when the postal system was running, they would write back and say, "Can we have more books?" And so books had a kind of intrinsic value. People wanted to keep them, they wanted to read them, they wanted to share them with their friends and so on. And that was really the origin of the books program, which developed in all sorts of other ways over the next 30 years. There was a system of person to person distribution later, which was very successful, by which visitors from Eastern Europe to the West could come to certain shops in London, say, or Paris or Vienna or wherever it was, and they'd be given 3 or 4 books to take home with them. They were given them for free on the understanding that they'd carry them back in their luggage, and then they would give books to traveling symphony orchestras or mountaineering clubs or sports teams. Wherever any Eastern Europeans showed up in the West, they were basically offered these kind of suitcases full of literature. So it was a very effective system because even if one shipment got caught, then there were always lots of other people carrying them through. So it was a kind of multifaceted hydra of an operation, if you like.
Yeah, that image of books falling out of the sky is just so delicious. I mean, it's just, I want to say something else about your writing at this point, Charlie, because uh, what you just described now in the CIA book club, you do it powerfully, but you also do it in just a little bit more than 3 pages. And the funny thing I found about this book is that it's about 280 pages long.
Mhm.
And I envisioned that at one point you had a 2,000 page first draft.
Yeah, I mean, I was constantly kind of chopping. I think you want the kind of powerful essence rather than the kind of long-winded, uh, watery version.
Do you think that's your experience as a journalist to be able to say something in an efficient amount of words?
Yeah, I think you've got to bear in mind the reader, and you know, you've got to kind of give them the goodies fairly quickly. I mean, I'm not saying that's true of everything, but I think. I would probably usually tend to prefer to write a shorter book than a longer one. And I know
Yeah,
this isn't true of all writers at all, but spending years on a project, you have a lot of information, and people don't they can't really cope with the amount of information that you have. I mean, I couldn't just drop all of this on somebody because they wouldn't be able to kind of wade through it. So I
right,
think, yeah, you're always trying to condense, trying to extract the kind of important essence of something. Always trying to, I mean, often, in the nonfiction world, a story like this is carried through hundreds of people. There were hundreds, probably thousands of people, certainly thousands of people involved in this story. And if you wrote this story for Hollywood, there would be about 3 people in it. So what I'm trying to do is I mean I can't amalgamate people. I
right.
can't create a character that basically carries 3 tasks or 3 narratives inside them. I've got to use real people. So I'm trying to restrict the number of people I introduce, and who so that people get more of a kind of connection with fewer people rather than overwhelming people with dozens.
Yeah, I don't know that if there's any research on this or anybody's done any thinking about it. And I think I'm going to indicate now I haven't done much thinking about it either. But those of us who are trained as journalists, um, we are well served by having a limited space. We know we have to say something in a certain amount of words and get the essential information in there in a palatable way, as opposed to a historian or a biographer who doesn't have that discipline. The disciplines are in other areas, and they turn in a 900-page manuscript.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'd like to give this some thought. The idea that if an editor were to say to you, "I love this book, give it to me in 300 words or 300 pages," that might be a interesting,
You mean
helpful.
a longer version than it is?
No, if the editor said to you, "You've got this sprawling story,
Yeah,
but I can't give you more than 300 pages,"
yeah,
that
yeah,
if you were trained as a journalist, you might say, "Oh, great. I can give you 300 pages.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you and me both could do that. I mean, sometimes I've had to take a book and turn it into a 3,000 word magazine piece, and it breaks your it breaks your heart sometimes, but it's possible, of course.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned George Minden earlier, the ambitious young employee in the FEC's New York office, which you portray as being in a seedy neighborhood, but at least surrounded by major publishers. Go, tell us what about George Minden, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so George Minden was a an emigre himself. He was born in Bucharest. He was a very wealthy man. I think he was one of the richest people in Romania before the Second World War. And he fled when the communists arrived at the end of the war. He was in Britain for a time and then washed up in New York in the mid 50s and joined the Free Europe Committee. And he was, I think, a very intelligent, very well-read, very sophisticated kind of man, very highly educated. And he ran the I mean he was quickly promoted through the Free Europe Committee to lead the book program, and he would lead it from I think the late 1950s till the end of the Cold War. And he had an office in Park Avenue South, in a kind of, I mean, it was basically a CIA front organization, which was called the International Literary Center, and it was on the 14th floor of this tower block. And he had a whole team in there. I mean, having worked in newspapers for much of my life, it resembles to me a little bit a newspaper office or maybe a publishing house. And he had desks for different East European countries, desk editors who would choose which works they were going to send to those countries. So there was a big Soviet section, and then there was a kind of Polish desk, which was the most important one in the rest of Eastern Europe. And yeah, Minden kind of oversaw this operation from his office on Park Avenue South. He was a very I've said how intelligent he was, but he was a great linguist. I think he spoke 6 or 7 languages. Um, and he would tour Europe twice a year to go and meet all his contacts, who, over the years became, I think, very good friends and very sort of long-standing friends of his. And they would discuss what works were going to be sent across, what they thought would be most powerful for the purposes of the book program, which were essentially propagandistic, but also they were really, I think there was a genuine idea that they wanted to break the straitjacket, as they called it, of Stalinism, and give the people of the East a kind of intellectual freedom that they weren't allowed to have. So, given that most of these people were actually emigres themselves, they had a real understanding of what it was like to live under this system, and many people had suffered under it in the early days of communism in their countries. So I think he was deeply motivated. He was a very frugal man. He was very tight with his budgets, which I think was probably helpful because the CIA didn't give them vast amounts of cash. I mean, I think they ran on probably $3 or $4 million a year most years. Yeah, but obviously smart and I think he had an idea that he wasn't that it was a kind of intellectual pursuit. He didn't really feel he was fighting the Cold War in a sense with literature. He was more trying to spread the kind of Western ideal of intellectual freedom back into the countries that he and his most of his staff had been forced to leave.
Yeah. It seems the program was in jeopardy, though, throughout its history. You tell us about President Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, had to personally intervene to keep it going. And there's a section, I really love this section of the book, where you indicate that the paramilitary types in the CIA didn't really approve of the program. And you quote a CIA historian as saying, The paramilitary guys thought real men don't sell books. Real men recruit spies. You go to one of these guys and say, look, I need $100,000 to buy books from the silver age of Russian literature. And they look at you like, are you a moron? Why would you waste money on stuff like that? When you spoke to current CIA personnel or recently retired agency employees, what was their view of the CIA book club?
Well, I spoke to people who worked on that side of the CIA. So, um, as I understand it, the impression I was given was that the CIA at that time was divided into these political psychological staffers who were very highly educated country specialists, often spoke the languages of the places that they were working on. And then there were the kind of ex-military or paramilitary people who were more concerned with, organizing kind of coups against regimes in Central America or Africa or wherever it was. So if you like, there's a sort of a schism between the intellectuals and the kind of bang bang paramilitary types,
I,
which is the source of that kind of tension that you refer to in that quote. But
yeah,
I think the problem for the book program was that the paramilitaries tended to get the top jobs, and so they tended to be in charge of things.
yeah,
And so I think Minden was constantly, and not just Minden, actually, people within his beneficiaries of the book program were constantly lobbying for it to be extended or enlarged. I mean, there's a very interesting character called Jerzy Giedroyc, who was based in Paris, who was a Polish expat, tremendous figure in Polish letters and literature, publisher, worked with the CIA from the early 50s onwards. And he was very connected to Brzezinski. I mean, there's a sort of nexus of Poles, expat Poles in the West who a guy called Jan Nowak Jurański is another one, and he was the founder of the Polish Radio Free Europe service. And they were quite influential in Washington, particularly in the Carter years, but also through the Reagan years, because they were on the National Security Council. They were they were in meetings with kind of CIA bosses all the time. So all of these people were kind of lobbying to protect the book program from the, I guess, more kind of shoot 'em, blow things up types.
yeah.
Yeah.
And today, I imagine CIA types are like bureaucrats everywhere, and that when something works, they'll take credit for it, even if they had nothing to do with it. But do you have any sense that the CIA now will acknowledge that this was a really successful program, well run and relatively inexpensively?
Well, the CIA have kept very stum about the whole operation. They have not released these. I mean, there must be a mountain of files of correspondence between the book program and people in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But that all remains classified, and there's no sign that it will become declassified. But there are a number of sort of ex-CIA people who have, I suppose, hinted at or written articles about in the kind of intelligence press about how successful it was. And I think there is a kind of understanding that it was a kind of undersung operation,
Great.
and one that, considering its meager kind of resources, did a really incredible job during the Cold War. I mean, there's this comparison I make between Operation Cyclone, which was the CIA funding of the Mujahideen and supplying them with weapons in Afghanistan, which I think cost something like $700 or $800 million a year at its high point in the 80s. And the book program was a very small fraction of that amount. So, given the differential sums that were spent, it's for obvious reasons Operation Cyclone is often given more credit than the book program was for
Right.
its role in ending the Cold War. But I think the book program, as I say, is kind of underrated to an extent.
Yeah. Are you aware of any similar programs today? I don't suppose physical books would have to be dropped in or smuggled in to have such a program, but you make a very convincing case that the way to win hearts and minds is through literature.
Yeah, I think I'm sure similar programs are going on today across the world from all sorts of different state actors. Of course, the difference now is that we have digital media, and I think literature is probably a too slow a way for these states to act, and we've seen Russia and other countries using social media and all sorts of digital media in order to kind of further their propaganda aims.
Right.
And I'm sure all sorts of countries are doing that. Um, I mean, the interesting thing, I suppose, about the present moment is that the Free Europe Committee was the kind of instigator of the radios, as they were called, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and so on. And the Trump administration has just pulled funding for those. I think their future is at best uncertain. So the projection of American soft power, of which the book program was a part, is now having the rug pulled from under it. And I guess people can argue about, whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I think having a kind of alternative voice, an alternative source of information in some countries like North Korea is probably a good thing. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's in some ways that's a shame.
Yeah. I want to get back to that subject of the application of American soft power, but there was a couple of things that you do in the book that give us an understanding of the depth of the reaction um, to this program and to the dissemination of these works of literature. Um, for example, I was really struck by what a number of readers behind the Iron Curtain said after reading Animal Farm or 1984 of Orwell. They said, "How did he know?"
Yeah.
And they had a sense then that the world somehow knew via fiction of what they were going through.
Mm.
Very powerful.
Yeah, I think Orwell was remarkable in his conjuring of their daily reality. And they would read Orwell and say, how did he know? How did he know what our lives were like? And Orwell had never traveled in Eastern Europe, I mean, his experiences, as I understand it, came from fighting in the Spanish Civil War. So he had some experience of a kind of a communist, I suppose, censorship operation or attempts to control the narrative, attempts to control people's minds. But I mean, his genius was to turn this into these whole worlds like you get in 1984, this extraordinarily well-drawn totalitarian state with, I draw this link, connection between the Ministry of Truth in 1984, which is Orwell's propaganda ministry, if you like, in this state, and how Winston Smith, the hero of 1984, is his job is to go through newspapers and documents and cut out things that have become inconvenient to the party. So he puts them down this incinerator chute called the memory hole. And when I was looking at how the censorship apparatus in Eastern Europe worked at that time, it was very similar. I mean, obviously he was satirizing, pastiching Stalinism, I suppose, in a way. So it's not that surprising. But the way the way people's ideas were sort of controlled, so people would tell me how they would go to school in Eastern Europe, and you had to speak in a certain way. You had to use a certain language that reinforced the kind of Marxist, Leninist theory. And so people would do that at school, and then they'd come home to their parents, and then their parents would, speaking in the family would be much freer.
Right.
So this idea, Orwell, this is Orwell's doublethink, as far as I can see. You have two ways of thinking, and you have to be able to operate in both environments at the same time. And someone like Hoyetsky, actually, he was in court in Poland in 1980, and he made a very kind of strong argument that this was absolutely crippling for Polish society and Polish culture, that you have these kind of, it's not quite hypocrisy, but it is doublethink, I suppose. You have these two codes, and he was trying to sort of elucidate the damage that does to the psyche, to the national psyche, and I think that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Early in the book, you have a wonderful quote. A Polish dissident says, I'm convinced it was books that were victorious in the fight. A book is like a reservoir of freedom, of independent thought, a reservoir of human dignity. They allowed us to survive and not go mad. Wonderful, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was from Adam Michnik, who is was one of the leaders of Solidarity. Now edits. He's editor in chief of I suppose, probably the best newspaper in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza, and he's a great sort of literary figure in Poland. And he spent much of the 80s in jail, and would tell me how, for instance, he would get a new when Gulag Archipelago was published, which it was published in the West first, and Michnik had a friend in Paris who bought it, got on a flight to Warsaw, and had it in his hands kind of that evening. So he was reading forbidden books all the time. He had, and he wouldn't tell me how he smuggled his own writings out of jail, even now, but he was able to do that quite freely. Um, and he was able to get books into jail past the prison guards fairly easily too. I think his method was to order the Russian edition because he could read Russian, but most Polish prison officers didn't read Russian. So he would get a book that was wrapped in a Russian jacket of a book that had won the Stalin Prize, something very,
Right.
very kind of pro-communist. And then they would bring it into him in jail, and then it would actually be something completely different. It would be a dissident text that he would read. So yeah, I mean, he great literary figure in Poland. So to have him say we should build a monument to books, I think really is testament to how significant they were.
Yeah. So in light of writing and researching this book, what do you make of what's happening in the States right now? We have book bans, we have political pressure applied to university and public institutions. Our historical museums are instructed to alter the narrative of their display, resulting in a kind of double think. What we say, oh yeah, he can change that, but we really know what
Mm.
happened. And then there's a sort of general disregard, if not disdain, for free expression. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's frightening and horrifying, frankly. I did a piece for the New York Times not too long ago about this, and the irony. I mean, irony is too almost too weak a word, but the irony of 1984 Animal Farm being banned. I mean, I know a lot of this is still under kind of judicial review of some kind, but the instinct to ban these books, which in Iowa seemed to come from a new law that basically censors any book that describes a sexual act. Well, 1984, it doesn't really have much sex. I mean, there's no graphic account of sex. I mean, there is a loving relationship in it, but the loving relationship is there to point up the total control of the state. Even love is destroyed by the state. The state is so jealous it wants love of individual humans for itself, and so you can't love each other, as it were. To ban Animal Farm, which, as far as I'm aware, has absolutely zero sex in it at all, is just absurd. So it's it's horrifying. The idea that the same books or the same authors that were being sent east in the Cold War as a sort of emblem of the Western freedoms that the US stood up for. The idea that those books are now being banned back home is just remarkable. I mean, it just shows you how far we've come and how easily these kind of lessons are forgotten because I mean, we're only kind of 3 decades since the Cold War was won. So
Do, do,
it's terrible.
I mean, what do you say to people who speculate that the hidden hand of the old Soviet regime is at work on some of these decisions being made here?
Whether Putin's behind it, you mean?
Or yes.
In the States, I haven't heard that, I have to say. That would seem to me a conspiracy theory too far, but these are crazy times.
No,
But
I think one of the benefits of reading your book, Charlie, is that I was alarmed several times during the experience. I read it
Mhm.
over the past week, and concurrently there were stories in the news that sounded, somewhat like a kind of writ small version of what was happening behind the old Soviet bloc.
Mm. I mean, I can't really say anything about
Yeah,
that. I
I
haven't
understand.
nothing tangible on that. I mean,
Uh,
I would say that the kind of Trump regime, as we might call it, is using Soviet style tactics to an extent, and one of them is this sort of Orwellian tactics, I guess we might say. One of them is to kind of claim that it's standing up for freedom of speech while simultaneously destroying it, or certainly destroying for parts of the media that it doesn't like. So there's a sort of a double think sort of hypocrisy in there, which I think Orwell would recognize.
yeah, I apologize for moving into such speculative
That's all right.
conversation because your book is so well substantiated. There's no speculation in it at all, as far as I can tell. What are you working on next, Charlie?
Well, I've taken a huge sideways turn, really. It's much closer to home, this book. It's about my home county of Yorkshire in the north of England and about sheepdogs. So yeah, it's
Oh
a very
my.
it's a great departure from the CIA. But I sincerely hope to return to that kind of cultural warfare topic when I can.
Yeah. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Charlie English, author of the CIA Book Club, The Secret Mission to Win the Cold War with Forbidden Literature. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.